Hi, welcome to week 6 of Christian Community Development in the Social Justice Tradition. This week we're going to be focusing on the Black Church and the Latina church traditions. And I'm going to focus primarily on the U.S. context this week, covering the global context in a future week. And the Black church in the U.S., it's worth stating, is probably the most well-known U.S. social justice tradition globally, primarily because of its role in the civil rights movement and from leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. Let me just connect some of the concepts we talked about before, and this is kind of going to be a recap, that, there's a lot of ways you can kind of diagram Black and Latina churches in terms of race and class. So, they're typically going to be racially centered, and there's a lot that are multi-class. It's very common for Black churches and Latina churches to be multi-class. But there's also a lot of Black churches that are, predominantly upper middle class, and then there's other Black churches that are predominantly lower middle or working class, or of the poor. Same thing with Latina churches. You have multi-class. One of probably the best multi-class church I've ever attended. We went to a congregation in Boston called Leon DeHuda that was just cared for everyone of all classes amazingly well. But there's also upper middle class Latina. Often they'll call themselves Latinx, and then there's others that are lower middle and working class. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but there's the typology here of really the unique role is to be a ministry of the Black community or ministry of the Latina community, but it has unique class identity, race-centric framework. And one of the advantages of this model is that the funding comes from the community being served. So there isn't this cultural mismatch between funders and those being served. So, one of our principles is following asset-based community development. So whenever we talk about different communities, in traditions, I want to talk about the strengths. So the strengths of the Black and Latina church traditions, it's the best model for indigenous leadership development. So if you look at what institution in the world has raised up more Black and Latina leaders, it's going to be the Black church and the Latina church. And that's just an amazing strength. So it's also amazing at helping to form ethnic identity development. So if you're Black and you grew up in the United States, then often you're in a society that defines you in terms that are not helpful and might cause you to look down on yourself. And supporting positive understanding of Black identity or African American identity is really important. So having self-leadership addressing racism. So the civil rights movement's a good example of that, and some of the worker movements in the Latina community. They're also have a much better understanding of a collectivist perspective and a people group focused theology. A lot of people have drawn analogies between Israel whenever it was oppressed and the African American community. And a lot of the principles from the Bible apply to that. And if you listen to a lot of sermons, they're going to talk about that. The expansion of civil rights for the Black and Latina community, and a unique understanding of needs of the Black and Latina community. And as I mentioned, having a funding base and constituents are the same, avoiding competing demands, and building from a long, diverse history. So, the Black church, the Latina church have a long history, and you have worship and cultural styles that fit the Black and Latina community. So that's the strengths. I also want to, our student body is, I think we're getting close to being half people of color, half white. I think we're about 60-40 right now in terms of white. But I want to just talk about some principles for white majority culture Christians and relating to Christians from oppressed people groups like the Black community. So one of those principles is, seek first, and a lot of you I get will have worked in communities and get these principles. So, first seek to understand rather than judge. So, just listing out the steps in an ethical identity development process. So step 2 is gaining, head knowledge. Read a lot of books about, African-American theology, learn about the culture, things along those lines. But then step 3 is heart growth. So that's immersion, advance in your ethical identity development. And really the difference between these two levels is it's the difference between taking a Spanish course and living for 2 years in a Spanish-speaking country. You're going to grow a whole lot more in your head, but also on a heart level. The other thing is take an asset-based approach. Focus on what are the strengths of that community and what you can learn from them. Recognize that many things just come down to cultural preference, so worship styles and dress. And I'm not, trying to say that everything follows that and just having a relativistic attitude, right? But whether we raise our hands in worship or not, I don't think that, that's more of a cultural style, right? So, and recognize, this is probably the most important, recognize and counter the tendency of those from the dominant culture to dominate and criticize other cultures. Hold on to your own truth, but recognize there may be planks in your own eye. So let me talk about this principle and how that works cross-culturally. And I talk about this because I want people who are coming from majority culture to understand, Black theology, to understand brown theology, and to appreciate it, and to not just first, say, oh, that's different than mine, and, try to understand and appreciate some of the differences. So, everyone knows the passage out of the Bible, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see more clearly to remove the speck of your brother's eye. So there's this diagram called the Johari window, and many of you have already seen this, and you say, what's known to you. So this is, and you could apply this to your own culture. So you know this about your own culture. Other people know this about your culture, and that's what's open. And sometimes this would be for self-growth. Often this is applied to self-growth. So hidden might be, so say someone's a hidden alcoholic, right? But there may be things about your culture that you're ashamed of, and you try to keep hidden from others, right? And then the part I want to talk about is this part that is known to others, but not known to self, right? So this would be your own personal blind spots. And, how do you handle your blind spots? How do you handle other people's blind spots? So, this would be, the hidden in this diagram. And here's the point of this diagram is, recognize that majority culture Christians will usually have larger cultural blind spots than minorities. Now, also, one of the other principles is majority culture Christians should focus on their own blind spots rather than critiquing others to avoid cultural imperialism. Now, let me talk a little bit of why this is really important. So when you come from a majority culture, a dominant culture, someone explaining to you your cultural blind spots is a bit like trying to explain to a fish what water is. A fish just lives in the water. It doesn't understand what water is. And even more, it would be like explaining to a fish what water is and then explaining that the water is dirty. Now, let me use another example. So if someone's bilingual or someone who can speak only one language, so someone who can speak English and Spanish is going to be in a better position to critique the relative strengths of each language versus someone who only speaks English, right? So someone who's bicultural is going to be able to say, okay, they're going to understand how to compare cultures better than someone who has just lived in one dominant culture. So recognize that, another point is to recognize that people from a minority culture often have their culture criticized constantly, and that can be very painful. So if you're in dominant culture, then it's going to be highly costly for people to criticize your culture. And it's not going to happen nearly as often. For my friends who come from a minority culture, my guess is they get their culture criticized 20 to 50 times more than I would, right? So, and that becomes a sore point. So if I know that someone has a wound in an area, I'm not going to poke my finger in it. And this isn't to say that we should just say that every culture, any culture is perfect. But I think you got to recognize is I've spent a good portion of my life in the Black church, and the Black church will self-criticize in private. It doesn't, African Americans won't self-criticize the Black church in public, because there's so much already in that gets taken advantage of if someone does that, and then they say, see another Black person saying that all Black people are this or that, right? And that's not helpful. So anyway, that's one of the principles that's important for people to recognize. Now, let me get some concrete examples. So, we talked about biblical understanding of justice and biblical understanding of reconciliation and redistribution. And that there's these 4 quadrants. You have vertical reconciliation with God, horizontal reconciliation with individuals, horizontal reconciliation between groups, and all that's, just how these are about relationships, right? But these are about structures. And, a lot of people say if we had the relationships right, we wouldn't need structures. Well, we live in a fallen world. So unless you don't believe that aspect of theology, then we need these structures. So you need to have things to help care for people's physical needs whenever they don't get met. We need to work to change the laws to become more just and social structures, right? So what happens though, and I would say that, the Black and Latina church, they're pretty close to the center. They haven't followed as much of a Western trajectory of breaking apart things, this analytical or reductionistic. So they're much closer to the center. If you think about the Black church, it often operates in all 4 of these quadrants fairly well. And what happens often from those that are coming from a lot of majority culture white churches, they're saying, my tradition's really good in this quadrant. And then you have this kind of cultural and theological imperialism, which says, all these things that your traditions say about these other quadrants, they're not important, or in fact that they're non-biblical. And that is where there starts to be, a bigger concern. Now, let me use another example. So there is the Black church, right? So then there is Black liberation theology. And a quick summary of Black liberation theology is that it takes a theology similar to that of Israel in Egypt, and saying, that the Black community has been oppressed, and it also takes, what many people call an Afrocentric approach to theology. And, some Black churches are going to follow that, and then some aren't. So that's what these overlapping diagrams. Now, something that's important to recognize is that about half of the Black church, at least, is evangelical. Follows, in many ways, my assessment is they follow evangelical principles probably more than a lot of white churches that say that they're evangelical. But there are a lot of Black Christians that would say they're a Black Christian, they are evangelical, and they follow Black liberation theology. And, a good example of this is a book by Carl Ellis that I read. He came out of InterVarsity, and it's a book published by InterVarsity, and it was called Free at Last, but it's integration of all of those. And the same principle also applies to the Latino-Latina church. So you have the Latino-Latina church, then you have the Catholic church. So, there's significant, much more significant portion of the Latino church is a part of the Catholic church. Then you have a group called Latin American Liberation Theology. We have links to that in this week. And then you have the Evangelicals or Pentecostal / charismatic. Now, what's important to recognize is you can have, just like you can have Latin American liberation theology that's also Catholic, you can have evangelicals that also follow Latin American liberation theology. And you also you can have, and this kind of blows some people's minds, you can have evangelicals that are Catholic or charismatics that are Catholic, right? And you can have some that would say that they're all four of these things. And I think that that's important to recognize, that there is a lot of diversity in the Black church, a lot of diversity in the Latino church, and to understand these tensions. So for someone who has studied all of these, they're going to understand a lot of the nuances a lot better than someone coming from majority culture. So that would be my encouragement before judging some of these different traditions. It might create pause to say, can you follow liberation theology and be evangelical? Well, there's a lot of people who do it, and how they do it might be different than the typical liberation theologian might take. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot.